I now invite the President and Vice-Chancellor, Professor Margaret Gardner, to present a candidate for the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa.
Chancellor, wonderful to hear jazz. It's always spectacular. Deputy Chancellor, Carol Schwartz is one of Australia's most respected business and community leaders. She is a Monash alumna with a Bachelor of Arts, a Bachelor of Laws and a Master of Business Administration. Ms Schwartz has an extensive career spanning business, property, the arts and community organisations and has been a director on many public company and government boards. Currently, Ms Schwartz holds the following roles. She is the Director of the Reserve Bank of Australia, Director of Property Developer Stockland, the Chair of Creative Partnerships Australia, and the Chair of Our Community, which is the award-winning hub for not-for-profits. Together with her husband, Ms Schwartz also established the Trawalla Foundation, which invests in social enterprises and opportunities that focus on arts, ideas, innovation and scholarship. Ms Schwartz is a passionate advocate for women's leadership and representation in business, and those of you who in any way might follow her activities in that regard will know she has been tireless in her support, absolutely tireless and passionate in her support for ensuring that women are represented in business, not just inside organisations but on the boards. She is the founding chair of the Women's Leadership Institute Australia and was the first woman to be inducted into the Australian Property Hall of Fame. In addition to her business career, which is significant, Ms Schwartz has an extensive history of community, government and philanthropic leadership. She's made invaluable contributions to the arts, to medical research, to higher education, to local communities and indeed to Melbourne's Jewish community. For her achievements in business and commerce and her contributions to community in the arts, Ms Schwartz was made a member of the Order of Australia in 2006. Prior to this, in 2001, she received the Centenary Medal in recognition of her outstanding service as a leading business executive and board participant. In 2010, Ms Schwartz was awarded a Monash University Fellowship for her significant community contributions through her professional distinction and outstanding service as a member of the Monash alumni. In 2012, she was recognised as one of Australia's most influential women in the Australian Financial Review and in Westpac's inaugural 100 Women of Influence Awards. It's a very broad and a very significant career, and one of which we at Monash are very proud. Deputy Chancellor, it gives me the greatest pleasure to present to you for admission to the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, Carol Judith Schwartz.
With the authority of Council, I admit you, Carol Judith Schwartz, to the degree of Doctor of Laws, honoris causa. I now have much pleasure in inviting Dr. Carol Schwartz to deliver the graduation address.
Well, thank you so much. Deputy Chancellor Yehudi Blecher, President and Vice-Chancellor Professor Margaret Gardner, Acting Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics Professor Robert Brooks, members of the faculty, family and friends. Well, I was very excited when I learned that I would be giving my speech to business graduates today. Business is the world I grew up in, the context in which a lot of family conversations occurred around our kitchen and dining room tables. But before I share a little of my own journey with you, let me first congratulate your parents or those closest to you on supporting you through your university degree. As a parent of 4 university graduates, I know what it takes to encourage, nurture, feed and support a young adult, your child, through a university degree. Congratulations to you. And to you, the graduates of business at this wonderful university, congratulations. As a graduate of Monash University myself, I know how demanding, all-consuming and overwhelming university studies can be at times. I hope you've been appropriately excited, stimulated and provoked in pursuing your degrees. I also hope you've all encountered adequate amounts of challenges along the way. Let's face it, we learn our best lessons from our trials and errors. So, as I said, my exposure to business was very much through my family. My grandparents arrived in Australia in the early 1920s, together with their siblings and parents. They were escaping what was called pogroms or attacks against Jewish families that had been terrorising Jewish communities in Russia for decades. They arrived in Australia with very little language and basically no financial backing and very little education, probably a typical immigrant story of that time. My great-grandparents worked hard to support their family and their children. My grandmother and her brothers also worked and then married and started to establish their own families. It was my grandmother, the only girl in the family, who turned out to be the most commercial and the most successful. She saw an opportunity to open a store selling ladies' lingerie and sleepwear, a need of Australian women that she did not believe was being fulfilled at that time. And she was right. Within a very short period, she had 3 successful city locations in Melbourne selling ladies' underwear, hosiery and nightgowns. In the meantime, in Europe, the Second World War had broken out. My father, born in what was once Austria, but now Romania, was forced to escape the Nazi invasion together with his parents, and escaping by boat, ended up in a refugee camp in Cyprus. After some time there, his family was then permitted by the British to settle in Israel. And from Israel, my father was granted a scholarship to come to Australia to study textile design at what was then called Geelong Technical College. He arrived in Australia around the age of 23. No money, no family, no connections, but with English as a second language, as his parents had insisted that he learn English as a young boy and teenager. What luck that turned out to be, as it gave him a huge advantage when he arrived in a country that spoke only English. Like many new immigrants, my father worked hard trying to establish a new life for himself. And as the entrepreneur that he is, some things failed and others succeeded. I guess one of his luckiest breaks was meeting and falling in love with my mother. My father had by then established quite a successful import and export business, but the regulatory environment around tariffs was about to change, which unfortunately made my father's business unviable. In the meantime, my grandmother's business, the 3 shops selling women's lingerie and sleepwear, was thriving. My grandmother, now in her early 50s, saw an opportunity to pass on the day-to-day running of the business onto her new son-in-law, my father. The story takes a giant leap from there as my father, in his true entrepreneurial style, grew the business into a national chain of over 500 stores, thousands of employees, with all the inevitable attached excitement, dramas, challenges and successes that entails. And that was the family that I grew up in, where school holidays were spent working in the stores, and the conversations with and about my grandmother were ever present, and the thrills and spills of an entrepreneurial business surrounded us. So when I graduated from Monash University with an arts law degree, and after completing my articles, I decided I definitely did not want to be a lawyer, and opened an aerobics and dance studio in Little Latrobe Street in the city, no one in my family was surprised. In fact, everyone was very excited and supportive. When I sold that business after I had my first child and came back to Monash to do an MBA part-time, whilst also doing some small property developments, again, my family was very supportive of my choices. When I graduated from my MBA, having just had my third child, my father invited me to join our family business in property. The retail business had invested in a number of shopping centres, which had then formed a new division of our family business that I was really very happy to work in. I remained working in the property division of our business for about 20 years. Along that journey, I was fortunate enough to be offered government and industry board positions, which, because I was working in a family business, I was lucky enough to be able to take up, as I had the flexibility to do so. And it was around this time, would have been the late 80s, early 90s, that I started to notice that there weren't many senior women in the room. In our family business, there were many women in senior roles, both family and non-family members. In fact, my father tells me he was the first retailer to employ women as store managers in his shops in the 1960s. But outside, in the world of institutional and corporate Australia, I was not seeing many women at all. What had happened to those really bright, ambitious young women who had been at university with me, studying law, economics and arts alongside their male colleagues? Why was I seeing all the young men that I'd been at university with making their way into legal partnerships and up the corporate ladder, and yet very few of the young women? I'll admit I was somewhat confused at first, but then that confusion soon turned to frustration and outrage as I saw the barriers to women's career progress right across the spectrum. And I started to ask the question in every public forum that I was invited to speak at, where are the women? And I tried in every context that I was involved in to ensure greater representation of women on the boards that I went on, at the conferences that I spoke at the lunches and dinners I was invited to. I always insisted that minimum numbers of women be included. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, there were always the most apologetic excuses imaginable. I cannot believe that 25 years later, we are still having the same conversations, discussions and debates about the lack of gender diversity and inclusiveness on boards, in senior management roles, at conferences, at business lunches and dinners. The progress has been glacial in light of all the research that shows the business case for gender diversity within organisations is absolutely irrefutable. And unfortunately, therefore, this is still a challenge for your generation. How are you going to ensure that inclusiveness and diversity are at the forefront of your organisational culture to make sure that your businesses will be the highest performing possible? Let me share with you some of the initiatives that I've been involved with in the last few years that I think may be just starting to move the dial. First and foremost, the panel pledge. As I've said, many high-profile conferences, events and task forces lack gender balance, despite there often being no shortage of qualified women. It is estimated that less than 15% of panellists in Australia are women, and less than 12% of experts cited in business newspapers are women. The lack of diversity not only limits the quality of the conversation and potential outcomes, it also obviously reinforces the gender stereotypes of men as leaders and spokespeople on behalf of business. The absence of women is self-perpetuating. So the panel pledge, which has been promoted consistently to business leaders over the last few years, asks that leader to ensure that when they're invited to speak on a panel, task force, or at a conference, that they inquire as to the gender balance of speakers, as well as to the composition of the audience. If the leader does not believe there is sufficient diversity, he or she may then suggest other women to be included and make their own appearance and financial sponsorship dependent on an acceptable gender balance. The pledge is starting to become really well known and having an impact, as we now see conferences and convenings that had very poor representation of women just a couple of years ago now having much better gender diversity. And multiple databases have been created to reinforce the fact that there are many, many well-qualified women who are ready, willing and able to take up the role of thought leaders, speakers and presenters. One other significant area that is being addressed very seriously now is unconscious bias. Unconscious bias refers to a bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. It's a bias that happens automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations influenced by our background, cultural environment, personal experiences. Resumes are a great example of gender bias at play, and many studies have shown that identical CVs, with the only difference being the name of the applicant, let's say John or Jennifer, John is preferenced over Jennifer most times. Many companies are now adopting blind screening. By removing gender-identifying information from resumes and other screening documentation, it is more likely that candidates will be judged on objective and relevant criteria. Symphony orchestras, after introducing blind auditions in which artists played behind a curtain in a carpeted room, found a dramatic increase in the number of women being appointed as musicians. More recently, a study in India showed that the work of female software coders was judged to be of a higher quality than that of their male colleagues, but only if evaluators did not know their gender. All of us, men and women together, are subject to unconscious biases. We need to be aware of this and ensure that we take on the training and the tools available to minimise the risk of making decisions based on these biases. So, I hope that I have sufficiently riled you all up now and made it obvious that there's a lot more work needed to be done by you, young men and women, standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, a new generation of participants in the world of business. While my generation has been working to shift the dial, there is still so much to be done. You, as the next generation of business leaders, can make a choice. You can either allow the status quo to persist, or you can challenge, question, poke and prod this status quo, knowing that gender equality will make your businesses, or the businesses that you may work for, and the society you live in, more productive, more innovative, and far more interesting. Remember, gender equality is not a zero-sum game. If women get a slice of the cake, there will be no less cake for men. More gender equality means more cake for all. As you move into leadership roles, you will all have the opportunity to shape in some small and some big ways how our society functions, changes, moves forward. As part of that, I want you to think about what you are passionate about and how you are going to fight for that. Today is an occasion to celebrate, and to be incredibly proud of your achievement. It is also an opportune time to reflect on the changes you want to see in the world and start thinking about how you're going to make that happen. Be authentic, courageous, passionate, and focused on what it is you want to achieve, and it's likely to happen. Once again, congratulations on your graduation.